Asylums during war, crisis, and social upheaval. The war arrives at the asylum. By the early 20th century, Britain's asylum system had become vast. Across England, Scotland, and Wales, towering psychiatric institutions dotted the countryside. They stood on hilltops and farmland, on the edges of cities, behind thick walls and long driveways lined with trees. Some held hundreds of patients. Others held thousands. Within their wards lived men and women whose lives had already been reshaped by confinement. But outside those walls, the world was beginning to change in ways no asylum system had ever prepared for. In 1914, Europe descended into war. The First World War did not only transform battlefields. It transformed hospitals, governments, economies, and institutions, including the asylums. Because when a nation goes to war, everything becomes strained. Food becomes scarce. Workers disappear into uniforms. Buildings are repurposed. Budgets collapse. And systems already struggling begin to crack. Inside Britain's asylums, those cracks widened. Quietly at first. Then catastrophically. The patients inside these institutions were among the most vulnerable people in the country. But during wartime, they were rarely the priority. Section 1: Staff shortages and institutional collapse. When war began, thousands of men across Britain were called to military service. Doctors joined the army. Nurses volunteered for war hospitals. Young attendants and orderlies enlisted. The same men who once supervised asylum wards were now marching toward the trenches of France and Belgium. The consequences for psychiatric institutions were immediate. Suddenly, many asylums were desperately understaffed. Wards that once had several attendants might now have only one. Night shifts stretched longer. Supervisors struggled to maintain order. The remaining staff were often older, exhausted, or inexperienced. Some hospitals began hiring workers with little training at all. Others relied heavily on female staff to fill roles once dominated by men. These women often carried enormous responsibilities with minimal support. Imagine a single attendant overseeing dozens of patients. Some confused. Some agitated. Some physically ill. Some prone to violence or self-harm. The risk of accidents, neglect, and abuse increased dramatically. Not necessarily because all staff were cruel, but because the system itself was buckling under pressure. And inside overcrowded wards, the patients felt the difference. Routine began to fray. Supervision weakened. Care deteriorated. The fragile balance of asylum life was starting to unravel. Section 2: Buildings requisitioned for war. As the war intensified, the British government faced an enormous medical challenge. Tens of thousands of wounded soldiers were returning from the front. Many required long-term hospital care. Existing military hospitals quickly filled beyond capacity. So officials began searching for new spaces. Large buildings. Facilities with wards. Places capable of housing hundreds of patients. The answer, in many cases, was obvious. Asylums. Across Britain, psychiatric hospitals were partially or completely requisitioned for military use. Entire wings were emptied. Some institutions were transformed into military hospitals for wounded soldiers. Beds once used by psychiatric patients were reassigned to men injured by artillery, gas attacks, and machine guns. This created a difficult and sometimes chaotic situation. Patients already living in asylums had to be relocated. Some were moved into already crowded wards. Others were transferred to different institutions miles away. Still others were discharged into communities that had little ability to care for them. These sudden displacements could be traumatic. Imagine living for years inside a controlled routine, and then suddenly being transported to an unfamiliar place. Different staff. Different patients. Different rules. For people already struggling with mental distress, such disruptions could be deeply destabilizing. Meanwhile, inside the newly converted military wards, another kind of suffering was emerging. One that would force society to reconsider its understanding of mental illness. Section 3. The emergence of shell shock. During the First World War, doctors began encountering a disturbing phenomenon among soldiers returning from the front. Men who had been physically healthy suddenly developed strange and alarming symptoms. Some trembled uncontrollably. Some lost the ability to speak. Some became paralyzed without any visible injury. Others suffered nightmares, panic attacks, hallucinations, or profound emotional collapse. At first, military authorities struggled to understand what was happening. Was it cowardice? Weakness? Nervous breakdown? The term that emerged was shell shock. The phrase suggested that the concussive force of artillery shells might be damaging the brain. But over time, doctors realized the problem was more complex. These men had been exposed to unimaginable trauma. Weeks or months inside muddy trenches. Constant bombardment. The deaths of friends and comrades. The psychological terror of modern industrial warfare. What we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder was revealing itself on a massive scale. For the first time in British history, large numbers of soldiers from respectable backgrounds were experiencing severe mental breakdown. And suddenly, society had to confront a difficult question. If brave soldiers could be psychologically shattered by trauma, then perhaps madness was not simply a moral failing. Perhaps it was a human response to unbearable stress. This realization began to challenge long-held assumptions about mental illness. But within the asylum system itself, change was slow. Very slow. Section 4. War trauma and the challenge to old psychiatric ideas. The phenomenon of shell shock forced doctors to reconsider the rigid categories they had long used to classify insanity. Previously, many psychiatric theories emphasized heredity. The belief that mental illness was largely inherited, a sign of degeneracy within a family line. But shell shock complicated that idea. Many affected soldiers came from stable backgrounds. They had lived normal lives. They had passed military medical examinations. Yet exposure to extreme trauma had broken them psychologically. The war revealed something unsettling. Mental stability could be fragile. Even strong, disciplined men could collapse under certain conditions. This realization slowly began to reshape psychiatric thinking. Some doctors began emphasizing the role of environment and experience. Trauma, stress, fear, loss. These factors, they argued, could profoundly affect the human mind. But despite these new insights, the institutional system remained largely unchanged. Asylums still functioned primarily as places of containment. Patients were still confined behind locked doors. And resources remained scarce, especially as the war dragged on year after year. Section 5. Economic strain and resource shortages. War is expensive. Nations pour enormous resources into weapons, soldiers, and logistics. And during the First World War, Britain diverted vast amounts of money toward the war effort. As a result, many civilian institutions suffered severe funding shortages. Asylums were no exception. Budgets shrank. Maintenance was postponed. Staff wages stagnated. Supplies became difficult to obtain. Food shortages began to affect the entire country. Inside asylums, these shortages could become particularly severe. Patients were already dependent on institutional kitchens for every meal. When food supplies dwindled, portions were reduced. Meals became simpler, less nutritious, more repetitive. Some institutions struggled to provide adequate heating during harsh winters. Coal was scarce. Buildings grew colder. Blankets wore thin. Medical supplies were also limited. Doctors sometimes had to make difficult choices about how to allocate resources. All of this contributed to a gradual deterioration in living conditions. And for patients who had little power or voice, these hardships could become invisible to the outside world. Section 6, the Second World War and renewed crisis. 2 decades later, Britain would once again find itself at war. In 1939, the outbreak of the Second World War placed enormous strain on the country's institutions. And once again, psychiatric hospitals were deeply affected. The pattern repeated itself. Staff shortages, resource scarcity, buildings repurposed for military needs. But this time, there was an additional danger. Air raids. German bombing campaigns targeted major British cities. Hospitals located near urban centers faced the risk of destruction. Some psychiatric patients were evacuated to rural institutions. Others were relocated in emergency conditions. Transporting vulnerable patients during wartime chaos was a difficult task. Many were frightened, disoriented. Some did not fully understand what was happening. Meanwhile, inside the asylums that remained open, overcrowding worsened. Wards designed for dozens of patients sometimes held far more. The atmosphere became tense, uncertain, and increasingly strained. Section 7, Wartime Neglect and Rising Death Rates. During the Second World War, evidence suggests that death rates in some British psychiatric institutions increased significantly. Several factors contributed to this: malnutrition, disease, overcrowding, limited medical resources, and understaffing. Some patients suffered from chronic physical illnesses that required careful treatment. But during wartime shortages, such care was not always available. Older patients were particularly vulnerable. So were those with weakened immune systems. Records from the era reveal tragic patterns. Deaths attributed to tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, general physical decline. Sometimes the official causes sounded clinical and neutral. But behind those administrative words lay human suffering. People who had already spent years confined inside institutional walls. People whose voices were rarely heard beyond those walls. In times of national crisis, they were among the most forgotten. Section 8. Institutional cracks become visible. Wartime pressures did something else as well. They exposed weaknesses that had long existed within the asylum system. Weaknesses that had previously been hidden by routine and bureaucracy. Overcrowding, underfunding, poor oversight, rigid hierarchies. In many institutions, these problems became impossible to ignore. Doctors and administrators sometimes struggled to maintain basic standards. Attendants were overworked. Patients were neglected. Small failures accumulated into larger systemic problems. And gradually, public attitudes towards psychiatric institutions began to shift. The idea that massive isolated asylums were the best solution for mental illness started to look increasingly questionable. But change would not happen overnight. The asylum system had been built over more than a century. Its buildings were enormous. Its bureaucracy deeply entrenched. Its culture resistant to reform. Still, the seeds of transformation had been planted. War had shaken the foundations of British society. It had transformed medicine, changed politics, altered public understanding of trauma, and exposed the vulnerability of institutions that once seemed permanent. Inside the asylums, the effects were profound. Patients endured shortages, dislocation, and worsening conditions. Staff struggled to maintain order with limited support. And the system itself revealed how fragile it truly was. The wars did not immediately end the asylum era. But they accelerated the slow process of questioning it. Because when society witnesses the psychological damage of war, it becomes harder to believe that madness belongs only behind walls. The line between the sane and the broken begins to blur. And once that line blurs, the entire logic of the asylum begins to tremble. The psychology of confinement. There is a particular kind of damage that does not leave bruises. It does not always bleed. It does not always scream. It does not always appear in an autopsy, a ledger, or an inspector's report. And yet it can hollow out a human being just as thoroughly as violence. It is the damage done when a person lives too long under total control. When every hour is decided for them. When every movement is watched. When every object they own can be taken away. When every opinion they express can be dismissed. When every protest can be reinterpreted as illness. When even their silence no longer belongs to them. This is the psychology of confinement. Because the asylum did not only confine the body. It reshaped the mind. It altered behavior, emotion, memory, social confidence, self-belief, and identity itself. And this is one of the darkest truths in the history of British asylums. Sometimes, what the institution called chronic madness was not simply the original illness. Sometimes it was the after effect of the institution itself. The longer a person lived behind walls, under rules, under observation, under endless routine, the more that life could begin to change them from the inside. Not always dramatically. Not in one sudden collapse. But gradually. Day by day. Ward by ward. Meal by meal. Bell by bell. Year by year. Until a person who once had preferences, spontaneity, pride, habits, ambitions, humor, privacy, and will, could begin to seem passive, flattened, hesitant, dependent, and strangely absent from themselves. And that transformation was often treated not as a warning sign of institutional harm, but as proof that the patient belonged there. 1. What happens to the mind in total institutions? To understand long-term confinement, we must first understand what kind of place an asylum really was. It was not simply a hospital. A hospital, at least in principle, is a place you enter for treatment and leave when recovered. A total institution is something far more consuming. It is a world that tries to absorb the whole person. A place where sleeping, washing, eating, praying, working, resting, obeying, and being watched all happen under one authority. A place where personal life and institutional life are no longer separate. A place where the individual is folded into a system. In British asylums, this often meant that a patient's day was structured down to the smallest detail. When to rise. When to wash. When to eat. Where to sit. Where to walk. When to speak. When to be silent. When to work. When to sleep. Routine was presented as therapeutic. And to a degree, routine can comfort distressed minds. But the routine of the asylum was rarely just supportive. It was disciplinary. Its purpose was not only to calm. It was to standardize. To regulate. To reduce unpredictability. To make large populations easier to manage. And when a human being lives too long in such a system, something fundamental begins to erode. Autonomy. The ability to decide. To act on one's own wishes. To manage ordinary life. To trust one's own judgment. In the outside world, even difficult life is full of choices. Small ones and large ones. What to wear. When to eat. Whether to speak or stay quiet. Whether to go outside. Whether to work or rest. How to arrange one's room. When to write a letter. Who to sit beside. How to spend an afternoon. These choices seem ordinary. So ordinary that most people barely notice them. But they are part of what makes a self feel real. They are daily rehearsals of agency. Inside the asylum, many of these choices disappeared. And when choice disappears for long enough, the mind begins to adapt. At first, a person may resist. They may object, refuse, question, argue, plead, or protest. But repeated overrule has a psychological effect. If every effort to control one's life is blocked, if every complaint changes nothing, if every act of defiance brings punishment, sedation, ridicule, or isolation, Then eventually many people stop trying. This is where learned helplessness begins to grow. Not because the person is naturally weak. Not because they lack intelligence. Not because they no longer care. But because repeated powerlessness teaches the nervous system a terrible lesson. Nothing you do matters. And once a mind begins to believe that, it starts conserving itself. Why ask if the answer is no? Why resist if resistance makes things worse? Why hope if hope keeps collapsing into disappointment? This is not recovery. It is adaptation to captivity. 2. Loss of autonomy and the slow shrinking of the self. Loss of autonomy does not always arrive with dramatic force. Sometimes it comes quietly. A confiscated possession. A locked door. A supervised bath. A letter that must be inspected before it is sent. A visit cut short. A rule explained in a tone that leaves no room for debate. A nurse deciding whether you are fit to walk outside. A doctor deciding whether your account of your own feelings can be trusted. Over time, these moments accumulate. And slowly, the patient learns that their personal boundaries no longer function the way they once did. Their body may be handled. Their emotions interpreted. Their words doubted. Their memory corrected by official notes. Their wishes subordinated to the institution's judgment. The result can be profound inner shrinking. A person begins to occupy less psychological space. They become careful, cautious, guarded. They stop asserting preferences. They stop volunteering thoughts. They stop expecting privacy. They begin, in a sense, to disappear in advance. To make themselves smaller before the institution can do it for them. And this shrinking of the self can be mistaken for calmness. A quiet patient may be described as settled. A compliant patient may be described as improved. A withdrawn patient may be described as manageable. But beneath that apparent quietness may lie something else entirely. Emotional exhaustion, humiliation, fear, or the gradual extinction of confidence. There is a cruel efficiency in systems like this. The institution often rewards the very behaviors it produces. Obedience is praised. Passivity is read as stability. Silence is read as order. Dependence is treated as evidence that the patient cannot cope alone. The person is shaped by the environment, and then judged according to the shape that environment has forced upon them. 3. The institutional self. After enough time inside, many patients developed what we might call an institutional self. Not their full self. Not their original self. But a survival self. A version of the person adapted to life under scrutiny. This self learns the unwritten rules. Do not speak too loudly. Do not complain too often. Do not attract attention unless necessary. Do not reveal too much emotion. Do not challenge staff unless you are prepared for consequences. Do not appear unruly. Do not let despair become too visible. For some, this meant silence. For others, politeness. For others, emotional numbness. For others, strategic compliance. Patients learned how to survive the mood of a ward. How to recognize when an attendant was irritable. How to avoid conflict with other patients. How to move through corridors without incident. How to ask for things in ways most likely to be granted. How to hide distress when showing it would only prolong confinement. Institutional life taught not freedom, but caution. And over years, that caution could harden into personality. A person who once laughed easily might become muted. A person once opinionated might become hesitant. A person once affectionate might grow distant. A person once lively might seem dulled. Again, outsiders might interpret this as the natural course of severe mental illness. And sometimes it was. But not always. Sometimes the institution itself was doing the shaping. The person was not only sick. They were being trained into submission. For silence, compliance, An emotional withdrawal. One of the most devastating features of long-term confinement is emotional withdrawal. In environments of chronic stress, the mind often seeks shelter not through action, but through retreat. A patient may stop speaking not because they have nothing to say, but because speaking has become dangerous, pointless, or painful. A patient may stop showing emotion not because they feel nothing, but because emotion has repeatedly been punished, misunderstood, or ignored. A patient may stop making relationships not because they are incapable of love or trust, but because institutional life is full of loss, transfer, death, surveillance, and instability. Why become attached when people disappear? Why confide when words can be used against you? Why invest in tomorrow when every day repeats the same architecture of power? Emotional withdrawal can become self-protection, a kind of inner barricade. And from the outside, it can look like apathy, blankness, chronic deterioration. But inside, something more complex may be happening. The patient may still feel intensely, still grieve, still remember, still dream. But the outward channel has narrowed. The institution has taught them that visible feeling is unsafe, so they retreat inward. This is one of the tragedies of asylum life. The conditions may produce a kind of deadened surface, and that surface is then treated as the patient's true condition. The institution reads its own psychological effects as diagnosis. 5. Resistance becoming risky. In any oppressive system, resistance carries a price. Inside the asylum, that price could be immediate. A person who argued might be marked as agitated. A person who refused work might be called uncooperative. A person who shouted in fear might be recorded as violent. A person who insisted they were sane might be seen as lacking insight. A person who resisted a procedure might be restrained for their own good. This is one of the most maddening traps of confinement. The more desperately a person protests, the more that protest may be used to justify further control. And once patients understand this, resistance becomes psychologically costly. Not because the desire to resist disappears, but because the system turns resistance into evidence. A patient learns quickly that open defiance can worsen their situation. They may lose privileges, lose access to visits, be watched more closely, be moved to another ward, be secluded, be medicated, be labeled troublesome. So many stop resisting openly. But silence should never be mistaken for consent. Compliance inside an institution may mean agreement, or fear, or exhaustion, or strategy, or the final conclusion that fighting is useless. That is the deep psychological violence of institutional power. It does not merely suppress resistance. It teaches resistance to fold in on itself. 6. Flattened identity. Every human being is made of layers. Memory, humor, desire, embarrassment, taste, history, contradiction, affection, regret, private rituals, old loyalties, petty dislikes, little joys. Identity lives in these details. But institutions flatten. They simplify. They reduce persons to categories that can be managed. Inside British asylums, people could become known less as full human beings and more as types. The melancholic woman, the troublesome man, the epileptic girl, the chronic case, the harmless idiot, the suicidal inmate, the dirty patient, the noisy one, the quiet one. The chart replaced the person. The label replaced the biography. And over time, even the patient might begin to experience themselves through these institutional terms. When no one asks about your former life. When no one uses your talents. When no one reflects back your complexity. When your past matters less than your ward behavior. Identity can begin to flatten from within. The person ceases to be a daughter who loved music, A teacher who once read poetry. A tailor with skilled hands. A mother with a particular laugh. A boy who wanted to become a carpenter. A woman who danced. A man who wrote letters in elegant script. Instead they become a patient number, a bed assignment, a diagnosis, a routine. Confinement does not only control life. It narrows the visible self until much of the person goes socially unseen. And what goes unseen long enough can start to feel unreal. 7. Time inside, when days stop moving normally. Another psychological wound of institutional life is the distortion of time. In ordinary life, time is marked by change. Seasons, work, family events, celebrations, conversations, travel, milestones, surprises. Even painful life moves. Inside long-stay institutions, time can become stagnant. The same bell. The same corridor. The same breakfast. The same ward faces. The same rules. The same supervised walk. The same bed. Days blur. Weeks lose shape. Years pass without the usual markers that make a life feel lived. This temporal flattening has a powerful effect on the mind. Hope becomes harder to sustain when nothing visibly changes. Motivation weakens when every day seems predetermined. Memory itself can blur when one period is almost indistinguishable from the next. For long-stay patients, life could begin to feel suspended. Not fully ended, but no longer progressing. And when a person feels that time is no longer carrying them forward, they may begin to detach from the future itself. Planning becomes alien. Desire becomes muted. The imagination contracts. This is another hidden consequence of long-term confinement. It can steal the sense of onward life. A person is not only confined in space. They are confined in time. 8. Release as another shock. We often imagine release from an asylum as a simple act of liberation. The door opens. The patient leaves. Freedom returns. But for many long-stay patients, release was not simple at all. It could be another shock. Another rupture. Another psychological crisis. Because what happens when a person has spent 10 years, 20 years, even 40 years in a world where every choice was made for them? What happens when someone has forgotten how to handle money, buy food, navigate streets, manage appointments, cook, rent a room, speak confidently to strangers, or make unsupervised decisions? What happens when the outside world has changed while they remained frozen in institutional time? Freedom, in such cases, can feel terrifying. Not because the institution was kind, but because dependency has been learned so deeply that ordinary life becomes overwhelming. A person may leave the ward only to discover that they no longer know how to inhabit the world. Crowds feel threatening. Noise feels too sharp. Choice feels paralyzing. Responsibility feels crushing. Loneliness feels unbearable. Some former patients struggled to survive outside. Some drifted into poverty. Some were readmitted. Some seemed unable to function except in institutional conditions. And this, too, could be interpreted cruelly. Officials might say, "You see? They cannot live freely. They need the institution." But the institution itself may have created much of that incapacity. After years of control, the muscles of independence can waste away. Not because the person lacks humanity. Because humanity requires use. Agency needs practice. Confidence needs social space. Freedom is not just the absence of walls. It is a skill of living that can be damaged. 9. Long-stay patients and the fear of the outside world. For patients who had entered the asylum young and remained there into middle age or old age, the outside world could become almost mythic. A place remembered more than known. Some had lost parents. Lost siblings. Lost spouses. Lost homes. Lost trades. Lost the very social networks that might once have received them back. For them, release did not mean returning to life exactly as it had been. That life was gone. The institution, however bleak, had become the structure around which their days were organized. Their terror at leaving was not proof that the asylum had been a true home. It was proof of how profoundly human beings can be reshaped by prolonged dependency. A bird kept too long in a cage may hesitate at the open door. Not because the cage is good, but because fear has been trained into freedom. This is one of the saddest dimensions of long-term confinement. A system built on confinement can wound a person so deeply that liberation itself becomes frightening. 10. The cruel paradox. And here we arrive at the central paradox. The institution often created the very passivity it claimed to observe. It stripped autonomy, then cited dependency. It punished initiative, then remarked on apathy. It flattened personality, then described chronic deterioration. It rewarded silence, then interpreted emotional emptiness as illness. It made independent living harder, then used that difficulty as proof that confinement was necessary. This is why the psychology of long-term confinement matters so much. Because without understanding it, we risk believing the institution's own narrative. We risk mistaking adaptation for disease. We risk confusing captivity's effects with the natural destiny of the confined. To be clear, many asylum patients were genuinely and profoundly unwell. Some experienced severe psychiatric conditions that would have required care in any era. But that truth does not erase another truth. The institution itself could deepen disability, prolong helplessness, and reshape personality in ways that had less to do with original illness than with the conditions of long-term confinement. And once that damage was done, it could be very difficult to reverse. 11. The invisible scar. Some wounds leave scars that anyone can see. Long-term confinement often leaves a scar in behavior. In hesitation. In lowered eyes. In chronic uncertainty. In the inability to choose without permission. In apologizing for existing. In fearing authority. In freezing when asked simple questions. In feeling safer with routine than with possibility. In carrying, long after release, the sense that one's life belongs to someone else. These are not dramatic cinematic symptoms. They are quieter. But they're devastating. And perhaps that is why they were so easily missed. Because confinement does not always announce itself. It lingers. In the body's posture. In speech. In confidence. In the fear of doing the wrong thing. In the habit of waiting to be told. A person may leave the asylum building and still carry the asylum inside them. The most chilling thing about the old asylum system is not only that it confined bodies. It is that it could colonize the inner life. It could teach a person to doubt themselves. To shrink themselves. To mute themselves. To wait. To obey. To stop imagining a future. To become, in the eyes of power, exactly what power needed them to be. And then, once transformed, they could be described as incurable. As chronic. As institutional. As no longer fit for ordinary life. But perhaps we should ask a different question. Not only what illness brought them inside, but what the institution did to them once they were there. Because sometimes the greatest psychological damage was not the madness that entered the asylum. It was the self that the asylum slowly unmade. And once a human being has been unmade in that way, the tragedy is not only confinement. It is that the world may later look at the wreckage and call it nature. When in truth, much of it was man-made. Why so many never left? When people imagine the old British asylums, they often picture a temporary stay. A place where someone entered in crisis, received treatment, and eventually returned to the outside world. But for thousands of patients, that is not what happened. For many, the asylum was not a chapter in life. It became the rest of life. Men and women entered in their 20s and died in their 70s. Some arrived during moments of grief, trauma, or breakdown. only to find themselves trapped in systems that had little interest in their eventual return to society. In theory, the purpose of the asylum was recovery. In practice, the system often drifted toward permanence. And the reasons for that permanence were not always medical. Illness was part of the story. But only part. Because once a person entered the machinery of the asylum system, many forces began quietly working against their return to the world outside. For some patients, recovery came too slowly. For others, recovery came, but the world beyond the walls had already closed its doors. And for still others, the institution itself began to redefine who they were. Not a person temporarily unwell, but a chronic case. A permanent inmate. A problem already solved by confinement. And so, year after year, bed after bed remained filled. Not necessarily because every patient was incurable, but because leaving the asylum was often far harder than entering it. 1. Recovery was not the only factor. In a perfect system, a patient would remain in an institution only as long as necessary. But the asylum system existed within a larger social reality. And that reality was often harsh. Even when a patient improved, several questions remained. Where would they live? Who would care for them? Who would employ them? Who would accept them? For many patients, the answers were painfully uncertain. Families that had once brought them to the asylum might no longer have the resources to take them back. A household already struggling with poverty could not easily absorb another dependent adult. Some relatives feared relapse. Others feared scandal. Mental illness carried heavy stigma in British society. A returning family member who had been confined for insanity could affect reputations, marriage prospects, employment opportunities, and social standing. Sometimes the family had simply moved on. Years had passed. Children had grown up. Parents had died. Homes had been sold. The social network that once defined the patient's life had quietly dissolved. And in such cases, discharge could become complicated. Even if a doctor believed the patient had stabilized, the question lingered. Where would they go? Without housing, work, or family support, release might only lead to homelessness, destitution, or imprisonment. So the institution remained the default solution. Not necessarily because it was the best place, but because society had created few alternatives. 2. Social abandonment. Some patients were not merely forgotten. They were abandoned. Families sometimes lost contact over the years. Letters stopped arriving. Visits became rare, then non-existent. In the early days of confinement, relatives might visit frequently. They might bring clothes, small gifts, news from home. But as months stretched into years, those visits could fade. Life outside continued. People moved away. New responsibilities emerged. New tragedies happened. The patient, meanwhile, remained in the same place. Sometimes staff noticed the pattern. A patient who once received visitors now sat quietly during visiting hours while others met their families. A patient who once spoke eagerly of home gradually stopped mentioning it. Over time, the absence of visitors could deepen the patient's sense of isolation. For some, the institution slowly became the only social world they had left. This abandonment was not always cruelly intentional. Sometimes it was the quiet erosion of connection. But its consequences were profound. Without family advocating for discharge, without someone outside asking about their progress, without someone willing to provide a place to live, a patient's chances of leaving diminished dramatically. The asylum, in effect, became their permanent address. 3. The power of the label. Another powerful barrier to release was the label itself. Once a person had been officially certified as insane, that label followed them. Medical records described their symptoms. Doctors wrote assessments. Committees reviewed cases. And the language used in those files could shape a patient's fate for years. Certain words carried enormous weight. Words like chronic, incurable, dangerous, or degenerate. These classifications did not merely describe a patient's condition. They created expectations about their future. A patient described as acute might be expected to recover. A patient described as chronic might be expected to remain indefinitely. And once such judgments were recorded, they could influence every future decision. Doctors reviewing the case might see the earlier label and assume the prognosis was already settled. Administrators might hesitate to release someone whose record suggested instability. Even if the patient improved, the bureaucratic memory of the institution remained cautious. The diagnosis became a kind of shadow identity. A story about the patient that followed them long after their actual symptoms had changed. 4. The category of the chronic patient. Within many British asylums, patients eventually fell into categories. Some were considered short-term cases. Others were long-term residents. And among the long-term group, one label carried particular weight: the chronic patient. A chronic patient was someone believed unlikely to recover fully. Someone whose illness was considered permanent or deeply entrenched. In theory, this category described genuine medical realities. Severe psychiatric conditions do exist, and some can last a lifetime. But the category also became administratively convenient. A chronic patient was someone the institution stopped expecting to cure. Someone whose future was no longer measured in months, but in decades. Once a patient entered this category, the system often shifted its focus. Instead of rehabilitation, the priority became management. Keeping the patient stable. Keeping the ward orderly. Maintaining routine. Recovery ceased to be the central goal. Containment took its place. And over time, chronic wards developed a very different atmosphere from acute wards. They were quieter, slower, more resigned. Many patients in these wards had lived inside the institution for years. Some had been admitted as young adults and were now middle-aged. Others had entered in middle age and were now elderly. They were the long shadows of the asylum system. Lives that had gradually fused with the institution itself. 5. Bureaucratic inertia. Large institutions develop their own momentum. Processes become routine. Files accumulate. Decisions move through layers of administration. And sometimes, patients remained confined simply because no one actively pushed for change. Discharging a patient required paperwork, medical reviews, communication with local authorities, arrangements for housing or supervision. Each step required time and effort. When institutions were overcrowded and understaffed, such efforts could be delayed. A patient might be described as improving. But improvement alone did not guarantee action. The system often waited for stability over long periods. Months could become years. And once a patient had lived inside for decades, the urgency of release sometimes faded. The institution had already absorbed them. They were no longer a temporary presence. They were part of the background population. Another bed filled. Another name in the register. Bureaucracy has a quiet power. It does not always oppress through violence. Sometimes it simply fails to move. And when systems fail to move, human lives can remain suspended within them. 6. Aging behind the walls. One of the most haunting realities of the asylum era was how many people aged entirely within its walls. A patient admitted at 25 might still be there at 50. Still there at 60. Still there at 70. The milestones that mark ordinary life could disappear completely. Marriage. Children. Careers. Homes. Friendships built over decades. All replaced by institutional routine. Instead of building a life, many patients watched life move past them from within enclosed grounds. The asylum became their world. They learned the rhythms of its seasons. The sound of its bells. The personalities of staff. The quiet politics of wards. The slow changes in architecture as buildings were repaired or expanded. But the outside world continued evolving in ways they rarely experienced. New technologies appeared. Cities grew. Society changed. For long-stay patients, these transformations often happened beyond reach. And by the time release was considered, they had grown old within the system. Old age itself became another barrier. An elderly patient with limited independence might be considered too vulnerable to discharge. The institution that had confined them for decades was now described as their safest environment. A tragic circular logic. The walls that had stolen their life were now presented as protection. 7. Fear from families and society. Fear also played a powerful role. Mental illness has long been misunderstood and stigmatized. Many families feared that bringing a former asylum patient home could lead to unpredictable behavior, social embarrassment, or renewed crisis. Neighbors might gossip. Employers might refuse to hire someone with a history of insanity. Communities could be suspicious or hostile. Even well-meaning relatives sometimes believed the asylum was the safest place. Not because they hated the patient, but because they believed professional supervision was necessary. These fears were reinforced by the language used to describe mental illness at the time. Patients were often portrayed as dangerous, unstable, or permanently broken. Such portrayals made reintegration into society extremely difficult. And so families sometimes declined to accept discharged relatives. Local authorities might hesitate to support them. Employers might close their doors. The stigma surrounding mental illness became a second prison. One without walls, but equally effective at keeping people confined. 8. The loneliness of the long-stay patient. Inside the asylum, long-stay patients developed complex emotional lives. They formed friendships, shared routines, recognized each other's habits. In some ways, the ward became a strange community. A fragile society of people who had all been cut off from the outside world. But there was also deep loneliness. Because many patients understood, at least partly, what had happened to them. They knew the years were passing. They knew they were growing older. They knew the world beyond the gates was changing. And some feared they would never see it again. In the quiet hours of the night. In the slow walks around institutional gardens. In the long lines for meals. Patients sometimes carried a private question. Am I ever leaving? For some, the answer arrived slowly. Not through a single announcement, but through the accumulation of years. At a certain point, the possibility of release began to feel unrealistic. Hope faded into routine. Routine hardened into permanence. And permanence became the silent truth of their existence. 9. The final tragedy. By the mid-20th century, British asylums contained thousands of long-stay patients. People who had entered during moments of crisis, but never found their way back out. Some truly required lifelong care. But others might have lived differently if society had provided housing, support, understanding, and community care. Instead, the asylum absorbed them. Year after year. Bed after bed. Ward after ward. A system originally built for treatment gradually became something else. A place where human beings could vanish from public life. Not violently. Not dramatically. But slowly. Administratively. Quietly. The tragedy was not always obvious to those outside the walls. Because the asylum system appeared orderly. Efficient. Professional. But behind that order lay thousands of lives paused indefinitely. Lives that might have unfolded in countless ways. Lives that instead remained suspended within institutional time. And for many of those patients, the gates of the asylum never opened again. The fall of the asylum system. The end of an era. For more than a century, the great psychiatric asylums of Britain dominated the landscape of mental health care. Massive red brick institutions rose above farmland and city outskirts like self-contained worlds. They had their own farms, their own laundries, their own bakeries, Their own cemeteries. Some had their own fire brigades, rail connections, power plants, and water systems. These institutions were not merely hospitals. They were entire ecosystems built to house thousands of people at once. From the outside, they often looked impressive. Towering clock towers, grand entrance halls, long, symmetrical wings stretching across enormous grounds. To Victorian reformers, they symbolized progress, the belief that society could humanely manage mental illness through order, structure, and medical supervision. But by the middle of the 20th century, something had begun to shift. Slowly at first. Quietly. Then more loudly. The very institutions once celebrated as humane solutions were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Questions began to circulate through newspapers, political debates, and medical conferences. Questions that were difficult for the asylum system to answer. What was really happening inside these vast institutions? Why were so many people spending decades there? Why did overcrowding persist? Why were conditions sometimes so bleak? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all: had the asylum system itself become part of the problem it was meant to solve? 1. Growing criticism in the 20th century. By the early 20th century, cracks in the asylum system were becoming harder to ignore. Investigations began to expose troubling realities. Inspectors reported overcrowded wards, patients sleeping in rows of closely packed beds, facilities designed for hundreds now housing thousands, staff stretched beyond their capacity, long waiting lists, patients lingering year after year with little expectation of release. At the same time, journalists began writing stories about life inside mental hospitals. Some accounts described kindness and dedication among staff, but others revealed something darker: neglect, institutional indifference, occasional cruelty. Stories emerged of patients left for hours in soiled clothing, of overcrowded dormitories filled with noise and distress, of treatments applied more for control than cure. These reports disturbed the public, because the asylum had always been presented as a place of protection, a refuge for those unable to cope with the world. But now a growing number of voices suggested that many asylums had become something else. Not healing centers, but warehouses for human beings. Places where the mentally ill were hidden away rather than truly helped. Human rights advocates began asking difficult questions. Did patients have meaningful legal protections? Could they challenge their confinement? Were their voices being heard? Or were they trapped inside systems where their testimony was automatically dismissed as madness? These questions slowly eroded public confidence in the asylum model. And once that confidence began to weaken, it never fully recovered. 2. Changing ideas in psychiatry. While social criticism grew, psychiatry itself was also changing. Earlier generations of doctors had often believed that severe mental illness required long-term institutional care. The asylum was seen as both treatment and protection. But new generations of psychiatrists began questioning this assumption. Some argued that enormous institutions actually harmed patients. They pointed out the psychological damage caused by long-term confinement, the loss of autonomy, the erosion of identity, the phenomenon of long-term confinement. Doctors began asking whether patients might recover better in smaller settings, places closer to their communities, places where they could maintain family relationships, places where treatment could occur without complete social exile. At the same time, broader cultural attitudes were evolving. Post-war societies increasingly emphasized human dignity, civil rights, and individual freedom. Large institutions that removed people from public life began to feel uncomfortable to many observers. The image of thousands of vulnerable individuals living behind locked doors no longer aligned with emerging ideals of personal liberty. The asylum system, once seen as enlightened reform, now began to appear outdated. A relic of another century. 3. The arrival of psychiatric medications. One of the most powerful forces driving change came from an unexpected direction: pharmaceutical science. In the 1950s, new psychiatric medications began to transform treatment possibilities. For the first time, drugs appeared that could significantly reduce symptoms of certain severe mental illnesses. Conditions that once caused intense agitation, hallucinations, or emotional instability could sometimes be managed with medication. These drugs were far from perfect. They had side effects. Some were poorly understood. But they offered something that had previously been rare: stabilization outside institutional walls. Patients who once required constant supervision might now live with their families, or in smaller community facilities, or even independently. For policymakers, this development had enormous implications. If psychiatric conditions could be managed medically, perhaps vast asylum complexes were no longer necessary. Perhaps the model of care itself needed to change. Instead of isolating patients in remote institutions, governments began considering a different approach: care within the community. Treatment integrated with ordinary life. This idea gradually gained momentum. And once the political conversation began shifting toward community care, the future of the old asylums became uncertain. Fought with a policy shift toward community care. By the mid-20th century, governments across Britain were seriously reconsidering the role of large psychiatric institutions. Policy reports began recommending change. Committees reviewed the state of mental health care. Reformers argued that the asylum system had grown too large, too impersonal, and too expensive. They proposed replacing it with a network of smaller services: outpatient clinics, community mental health teams, residential homes, support programs integrated with local communities. The idea sounded promising. Instead of isolating individuals from society, mental health care would now take place within society itself. Patients could remain closer to their families, closer to work, closer to ordinary life. This turning point became known as the Great Shift away from life behind walls. And once governments committed to this direction, the fate of the great asylum complexes was sealed. The era of mass confinement was coming to an end. 5. The closure of the great asylums. Beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, one by one, Britain's great asylums began to close. Some shut their doors gradually. Wards emptied slowly as patients were discharged or transferred. Others closed more abruptly when policies demanded rapid reductions in institutional populations. Patients who had lived inside for decades were suddenly relocated. Some moved to smaller psychiatric units within general hospitals. Others entered community housing programs. Some returned to families who had not lived with them in years. The closures were historic. Buildings that had once housed thousands now stood partially empty. The great Victorian complexes that had dominated mental health care for generations were being dismantled. To some observers, this felt like liberation. The end of an oppressive system. The dismantling of institutions that had confined vulnerable people for far too long. But the transition was not always smooth. And for many former patients, the new world outside the asylum was not easy. 6. Freedom and new forms of struggle. For some patients, leaving the asylum brought genuine freedom. They reunited with families, found new homes, began rebuilding lives that had been interrupted decades earlier. But others struggled. The community support systems promised by policymakers were not always fully developed. Housing was limited. Mental health services were unevenly distributed. Some patients found themselves navigating unfamiliar environments after years of institutional routine. The outside world could feel overwhelming. Noise, crowds, decisions, responsibilities. Many long-term patients had never managed finances, housing, or employment independently. And without sufficient support, some fell through the cracks. A few ended up homeless. Others cycled between hospitals, shelters, and temporary accommodations. Critics of the move away from institutions argued that the asylum system had been replaced not with strong community care, but with fragmented services. The walls had come down, but the social safety net was sometimes thin. The fall of the asylum solved some problems, while creating new challenges that society was still learning to address. 7. The abandoned giants. As the last patients departed, the buildings themselves were left behind. Massive structures designed for thousands of residents suddenly stood empty. Long corridors once filled with footsteps and voices became silent. Wards where patients had spent decades were abandoned. Furniture was removed. Windows boarded. Doors locked. Nature began creeping back. Weeds pushed through cracked pavements. Trees grew in neglected courtyards. Rain seeped through damaged roofs. Paint peeled from long-forgotten walls. In many places, the former asylums became eerie relics. Too large to easily demolish. Too historically significant to ignore. Some were eventually converted into apartments or offices. Others were partially demolished. But many remained standing for years as ghostly monuments to the past. Urban explorers and historians began visiting these abandoned sites. They documented crumbling corridors, rusting hospital beds, faded patient records left behind in forgotten offices. Each empty building carried the silent imprint of thousands of lives once lived within its walls. Lives full of suffering, resilience, tragedy, and endurance. 8. Echoes of the past. Walking through an abandoned asylum today can feel strangely unsettling. The architecture still whispers its purpose. Narrow observation windows indoors. Heavy locks. Long wards lined with bed frames. Treatment rooms where medical theories once shaped human lives. In the silence, it is easy to imagine the past. The bells ringing at dawn. The shuffling footsteps of patients in the corridors. The voices echoing through the wards. The attendants carrying keys. The doctors making rounds. The quiet despair of someone wondering if they would ever leave. These buildings are more than historical ruins. They are physical memories. Concrete and brick reminders of a time when society believed that the solution to mental suffering was separation. Isolation. Containment. The fall of the asylum system did not erase that history. It merely ended one chapter of it. The legacy of the asylum era. Today, mental health care continues to evolve. New therapies. New medications. New understandings of trauma, psychology, and human resilience. But the story of the asylum still matters. Because it reminds us how easily good intentions can become rigid systems. How institutions designed to help can gradually lose sight of the individuals within them. How power, bureaucracy, and fear can shape the treatment of society's most vulnerable people. The great asylums of Britain are gone. Their wards emptied. Their gates unlocked. But the questions they raise remain with us. How should society care for those who suffer mentally? How do we balance protection with freedom? How do we prevent compassion from turning into confinement? The ruins of the asylum stand as quiet witnesses to these questions. Monuments to an era when thousands of lives unfolded behind locked doors. And reminders that the way we treat the vulnerable will always reveal the deepest values of our society. Because history does not simply disappear. Sometimes it waits in silent buildings, echoing through empty corridors, asking whether we have truly learned from what happened there.